She walked in unnoticed, but with one perfect shot, Clara Reynolds silenced the room, stunned a champion, and stirred a memory that changed everything. Watch till the end and tell us, what would you have done in her place? At the edge of the Massachusetts countryside, nestled behind rows of pine and a gated entrance lined with brass plaques, stood the Magnolia Ridge Shooting Club, an institution known less for its sport and more for its exclusivity. It was a place where CEOs talked strategy over custom rifles and senators practiced form under the guidance of private coaches. On a brisk Saturday morning, Clara Reynolds stepped through its heavy oak doors, clutching a worn leather purse and an envelope that had been handled too many times. At 43, Clara didn't command attention. She wore a cardigan that had seen more seasons than it should have, and her jeans, though clean, spoke of function, not fashion. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wasn't there to impress anyone, just to keep a promise she'd made long ago. The reception area gleamed with polished floors and sharp glances. A blonde woman behind the desk barely looked up, offering a practiced smile that faded the moment she saw Clara. "Members only," she said flatly, eyeing Clara's shoes like they didn't belong on the tile. Clara quietly opened the envelope and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "It's a day pass," she said, her voice even. It was a gift. The receptionist hesitated, sighed, and tapped something into the computer without looking Clara in the eye. Across the room, leaning against the display case of trophy rifles, stood Chad Whitmore, 45, five-time national champion and darling of the shooting world. Tall, tan, and dressed in head-to-toe branded gear, he noticed Clara immediately. Not out of curiosity, but amusement. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn at the mall," he said loudly, earning chuckles from his entourage. Clara didn't react. She simply walked toward the practice range, her gaze fixed ahead, carrying nothing but her purse and an old story no one cared to hear. The practice range at Magnolia Ridge sat at the far end of the property, quiet and shadowed by tall evergreens that muffled the distant crack of rifles. Clara chose the last booth, the one tucked away from the others, where no one would bother to watch. At least, not at first. She set her purse down gently, unzipped it, and pulled out a small cloth bundle, the kind that looked more like it should hold silverware than a firearm. With care, born of ritual, she unwrapped it to reveal a well-kept Glock 19, plain and practical, without a single custom modification. Around her, gun barrels gleamed with titanium finishes and names engraved in gold. Hers was different, familiar, honest. She checked the magazine, then the chamber, fingers moving in calm sequence. Across the room, Chad watched with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. $10 says she can't hit the paper," one of his buddies joked, and Chad laughed. "Make it 10,000, he replied, straightening up. "I bet she's never even fired a gun before." Then, with theatrical confidence, he strolled toward Clara's booth. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, in that polite but cutting tone some men reserve for waitresses and women who shop at discount stores. "You sure you're in the right place? This isn't a knitting circle." Clara looked up slowly, hazel eyes steady, voice quiet but firm. "I'm here to practice." Chad tilted his head, smiling like he'd found a new toy. 50 yards, he said. "You hit the bullseye, I'll pay you 10 grand. Miss, and you walk away. Simple as that." For a long moment, Clara didn't answer. She looked down at the simple gold ring on her finger, twisting it gently, as if feeling for a pulse in the past. Then, with a nod, she said, "All right." That single word changed the air in the room. Chad's grin widened, and a small crowd began to gather. No one noticed the slight shift in Clara's posture, how her spine straightened, how her shoulders relaxed. No one paid attention to the grip she used, firm and deliberate, or how her breathing slowed with each heartbeat. They saw a quiet woman in old clothes, not the years of training etched into every muscle memory. Clara raised the Glock, lined up the sight, took one deep breath, and fired. The sound was sharp, clean, final. When the target reeled back and came into view, the room fell silent. One hole, dead center, bullseye. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The target sheet flapped slightly as the mechanism settled, the single hole in its center as clear and undeniable as the silence it caused. Chad's smirk faltered, the easy confidence in his posture tightening just enough for those watching closely to notice. He stepped forward, snatched the target from the clip, and held it up for all to see, as if searching for a hidden flaw. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, but there was an edge in his voice now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Clara stood quietly, lowering her weapon with calm hands, her expression unchanged. Rebecca Monroe, the club's manager and a former competitive shooter herself, approached from the sidelines, her eyes flickering between the two. "That was an exceptional shot," she said gently, but Chad waved her off. "Let's raise the stakes," he said loudly, regaining his theatrical tone, trying to take back the room. 3 shots, 75 yards. If you hit 3 bullseyes in a row, you win $50,000. If you miss even one, you admit you cheated and walk away. Deal." The crowd murmured, the tension thickening like steam in a closed room. Clara turned her gaze toward Chad. She didn't blink. "Only if the money goes to the Veterans Honor Fund," she replied. Her voice was steady, firm, not loud, but it carried. Chad hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a grin. "Fine," he said. "Not like you'll win anyway." As Clara stepped back to reload, memories pressed in like the weight of a tide. The last time she had held this Glock in public was 3 years ago, 2 days before Jack left for his final deployment. He had insisted they go to the range one last time, even though his knee was still healing. "Promise me you'll keep practicing," he had said, brushing her hair back, his touch gentle, but his eyes serious. She hadn't understood why the request had felt so heavy then. Now she did. She loaded 3 fresh rounds, adjusted her stance, and let her breath flow like a slow river. The range master called the distance, and the target was sent down the line, nearly disappearing from view. Clara lifted the Glock, the world narrowing to the space between her sight and the distant paper. She fired once, then again, then a third time. The crowd leaned forward. Slowly, the target reeled back in, mechanical clicks echoing through the quiet. 3 holes. 3 bullseyes. Perfect. Chad Whitmore stared at the target in disbelief, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edges of the paper like it might somehow confess to a trick. Around him, murmurs began to ripple, low voices, shifting glances, quiet gasps of awe. Clara Reynolds stood where she had fired her last shot, calm as a lake at dawn, the Glock resting on the table beside her, hands now folded lightly in front of her. She hadn't smiled, hadn't gloated. She simply watched. Rebecca Monroe stepped forward again, clearing her throat gently. "Miss Reynolds," she said, her tone warmer now, touched with something like admiration. "Perhaps you'd like to try our advanced range facilities. Clearly, you're no beginner." But before Clara could respond, Chad raised his voice. "Hold on!" he snapped, his words slicing through the gathering noise. "One lucky round of shots doesn't make her a professional. Let's see if she can do it again. This time with real stakes." The tension shifted. Excitement turned to something more electric, more dangerous. "1 week from today," Chad announced, pulling a crisp checkbook from his jacket. "A full competition. 10 shooting stations, varying distances, club-provided equipment. No tricks, no excuses." He turned toward Clara, his smile sharp and cold. "Winner takes 50,000. Loser walks away. Let's find out if lightning really strikes twice." Clara considered walking away. She hadn't come for glory, for wagers, or to make a spectacle. She had come for Jack, to keep the promise she had made in the shadow of his coffin, holding the folded flag against her chest. But something about Chad's voice, that condescension wrapped in wealth and reputation, stirred something in her. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been underestimated, ignored, dismissed. "I accept," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "On one condition. If I win again, the money still goes to the Veterans Honor Fund." There was a beat of silence, then a scattered round of applause from somewhere in the back. Chad nodded, lips pressed tight. "Deal," he muttered. But as the crowd began to disperse, Rebecca leaned in toward Clara and whispered, "Be careful. Chad doesn't lose gracefully." Clara nodded once, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind something heavier. "I didn't come looking for trouble," she replied softly. "I just came to keep a promise." Neither of them noticed Chad on the phone in the corner, his voice low, urgent. "Find out who she is," he said. "Everything. I don't care what it costs." By the next morning, Clara's name had already begun to circulate in whispers through Boston's elite circles. The story of the unknown woman who had humbled Chad Whitmore at Magnolia Ridge spread faster than wildfire in August. At first, Clara tried to ignore the noise. She returned to work at the accounting firm downtown, answering emails and reviewing quarterly budgets like nothing had changed. But the phone calls started. Old friends she hadn't spoken to in years reached out, and 3 different local news outlets left messages asking for interviews. She declined them all. The attention wasn't what she wanted. But across town, in a high-rise apartment overlooking the Charles River, Chad was unraveling. His investigator had turned up almost nothing. No criminal record, no competitive shooting history, no social media. Clara Reynolds, age 43, worked as a senior accountant, moved from Virginia Beach 3 years ago, and lived alone. "It doesn't make sense," Chad muttered as he paced his living room, drink in hand. "Nobody shoots like that without training. Keep digging. Focus on Virginia." That night, Clara sat in her small kitchen, the air still, the kettle whistling low behind her. She reached for the wooden box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were Jack's medals, his old journal, a photograph from their wedding, and beneath it all, a small, weathered notebook filled with handwritten notes and diagrams, his shooting formulas, wind adjustments, stance corrections. She ran her fingers across the pages like they were braille for the soul. The next morning, she called in sick for the first time in 3 years. Instead of heading to the office, she drove to a quiet public range outside the city, far from the polished floors and whispered judgment of Magnolia Ridge. For 8 hours straight, she practiced, sighting, breathing, adjusting for wind, remembering everything Jack had taught her. Each shot was not just about the competition, but about reclaiming something she had buried under 3 years of grief. That evening, a text came from Rebecca Monroe. "Heads up, Chad requested rule changes. 10 different firearms, varying distances, approved by the board." Clara read the message in silence, then replied with only one line. "Thank you. No changes needed on my end." Across the city, Chad received confirmation with a grin. 10 stations, 10 weapons. She won't keep up, he said. But Jessica, his girlfriend, watched him from across the room with unease. And if she does? Chad didn't answer. He just smiled, cold, calculated. She won't. The morning of the competition arrived with a soft mist hanging low over the hills, wrapping the Magnolia Ridge Shooting Club in a quiet, eerie calm. But inside the gates, the atmosphere was anything but still. The club had opened its doors to the public for the first time in years, turning what was once a private challenge into a full-blown spectacle. Reporters hovered near the entrance, camera crews set up tripods, and spectators filled the gallery seats, murmuring in anticipation. Chad arrived first, flanked by sponsors and club officials, dressed in a sleek shooting jacket adorned with patches and logos, every detail curated for optics. His handshake with the club chairman was firm, his grin controlled, but behind his eyes something flickered. Restlessness, maybe even fear. Clara arrived 15 minutes later, alone, dressed simply in a navy button-down and jeans. She carried nothing but a small duffel and Jack's old notebook tucked safely inside. Rebecca Monroe met her at the side entrance, lowering her voice as she leaned in. "I checked the equipment. There are inconsistencies, nothing I can flag officially, but enough to give someone an edge if they knew what to expect." Clara gave a single nod. "Thank you," she said, and kept walking. The first few stations played out like a dance between two very different rhythms. Chad's movements were showy and calculated, meant for the crowd, with flourishes between each shot. Clara was the opposite. Quiet, still, focused. She wasted no motion, no energy, every shot as clean as the last. By the fourth station, they were neck and neck. At the fifth, Clara encountered the first sabotage. The trigger pull on the Sig Sauer was heavier than regulation. But Jack's voice echoed in her mind. "Conditions change. Equipment fails. You adapt." She adjusted her stance, shifted her grip, and matched Chad's score. As they moved to Station 6, then 7, a pattern became clear. Chad excelled with competition-style firearms, sleek, customized, predictable. But Clara showed an uncanny steadiness with the more rugged military-grade models. Veterans in the crowd began to nod, whispering among themselves. By the 8th station, the scores were nearly even. Chad's jaw was clenched now, his earlier confidence brittle under the weight of Clara's quiet consistency. Before the 9th station, he approached her, voice low and sharp. "You're good," he admitted. "But let's see how you handle pressure." Clara met his gaze, unwavering. "I've been handling it for a long time," she said, and turned back to the line. The 9th station left them tied, each shooter having demonstrated a level of precision that kept the crowd silent and leaning forward with bated breath. Now, everything hinged on the 10th and final challenge, a test designed by the club itself, featuring a Macmillan TAC 338, a long-range precision rifle so rare that only a handful of civilians had access to it. Chad had trained extensively with it. Clara had handled it only once, days earlier, under the quiet tutelage of a former SEAL named Commander Douglas, who had shown up unannounced to help her prepare. As Clara approached the final station, she noticed it immediately. The scope had been adjusted, the stock ever so slightly shifted. Not enough to trigger a protest, but enough to cause doubt. She didn't protest. Instead, she opened Jack's notebook and flipped to the page marked with his handwriting. Formulas for compensating scope drift, notes on grip pressure, reminders about wind corrections. She breathed slowly, recalling Commander Douglas's steady voice. "It's just magnified. Trust what you already know." Chad shot first, placing 9 out of 10 rounds cleanly in the inner rings, an impressive display that drew a smattering of applause and a few cheers from his camp. Then Clara stepped up, kneeling slowly, setting her shoulders into alignment, letting the noise fall away until there was only the target, the rifle, and Jack's presence beside her like a quiet breath. Her first shot rang out clean and true. Then the second. Then the third. One by one, she sent each round downrange, her breathing calm, her hands steady. On the final shot, just as she pulled the trigger, a sharp glint of light flickered in her scope, a distraction from someone near Chad's entourage. She paused, let the tension flow out of her muscles, adjusted, and fired. Bullseye. The 10th round hit home. The crowd erupted, first in disbelief, then in applause that rolled like thunder across the open range. Rebecca stepped forward with the official results. Clara Reynolds, first place. Chad Whitmore, second. Chad tried to smile, but his jaw trembled, his face pale with fury. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath as he offered a stiff handshake. Clara met his eyes and replied, calm and clear, "For today, it is. And you owe 50,000 to the Veterans Honor Fund." He turned away, but the damage was done. Behind him, Rebecca held up a tablet, security footage of his assistant tampering with the equipment. The crowd gasped. The applause turned into something deeper. Respect. Clara hadn't just won. She had endured with grace and strength that couldn't be bought, faked, or rigged. If Clara's story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that quiet strength can speak louder than power. Support our veterans by learning more about the Veterans Honor Fund and how precision, patience, and purpose can rebuild lives. And the next time you're underestimated, remember Clara Reynolds. One steady hand, one perfect shot, one promise kept.